We're going to go ahead and get started for our last session. Our last session at the Rare Drug Development Symposium. So the themes of this conference have been around patient advocate engagement and driving the drug development process. And a key component of drug development is obviously clinical trials. And so that's what we're going to focus on in this final session of the symposium. So we're going to start out by introducing something called Early and Often, which is a framework that we have been developing through a collaborative process of Global Gene's Corporate Alliance, as well as our global members of our Global Advocacy Alliance. And then we're going to use that as a springboard to talk about some real-life, real-world examples and lessons learned around how patients can be engaged in drug development successfully. And then we will have, hopefully, a little bit of time at the end for questions, so make sure you're thinking about those. I am joined on the stage here today by Wendy Erler, who is Senior Vice President of Patient Affairs at Sarepta, and by Steve Roberds, who is the Chief Scientific Officer at the TSC Alliance. And so I am going to ask Wendy to kick us off and share a little bit about this Early and Often framework.
Thanks so much, Charlene. Thanks for having us. So we're really excited to just give you a high-level overview to the work that Global Genes has been leading, and as Charlene said, in very close partnership with a lot of stakeholders across the whole rare disease ecosystem. But I want to take us back a little bit. A couple years ago, Global Genes led work that resulted in a paper being published called The Power of Being Counted. And why does that matter? For a long time, we threw around a lot of words around how many rare diseases there were, and the data and the statistics around that were, quite frankly, not very well sourced and all over the place. And there was a conventional wisdom that there were about 5,000 to 6,000 rare diseases. What we realized in doing work around how do you get the attention of drug developers for rare is really quantifying, aka naming conditions, is important, because if a condition has a diagnosis and a name, there's a community, there's a place to find patients to be in clinical trials. It all ties together. So we did a scientific review that was very comprehensive across a number of external data sources to update and validate the actual number of rare diseases, and then offer patient communities recommendations to ensure they're being counted. And this work resulted in a paper and updated the current number of known named rare diseases to be around just under 11,000. So it really almost doubled the number of known conditions. And if you think about things kind of from the esoteric perspective of funding, research funding, lab investment, all of these things, really quantifying the problem became important. Estimates had remained static, even though about 300 new rare genetic disease descriptions are added to knowledge bases and publication sources each year. So that's why we invested in this work. And then we mapped the disease disorders by stage, breaking down the almost 11,000 counted rare diseases by associated phenotypes and genetic basis. And all of this work came together working with Orphanet and other sources, and is validated and scientifically and statistically rigorous. So our call to action is use the new number because it matters, and being counted is really important. So the methodology was developed to be able to grow at scale as more advances are made in whole genome newborn screening, in all sorts of genetic testing. The diseases are characterized based on the robustness of the disease descriptions. And there's a path that most rare diseases follow that takes it from obscurity, aka ultra rare, to a condition that is well understood, readily diagnosed, and treated. So with this backdrop, we started working on what happens next. And as Charlene said, the portal of entry for many rare disease families to any modicum of care in their condition is often a clinical trial. On the other end of the spectrum, my experience is all in drug development on the industry side, which makes huge contributions to advancing science in all sorts of rare conditions. But clinical trial, the methodology and the model is very, very expensive. So we also wanted to practically identify how, when, where, and why should patients, patient advocacy groups, the community at large be involved in clinical trial design, given the sheer number of rare diseases that exist and the interest in ensuring there's participation by pharmaceutical companies in advancing research across that entire ecosystem. So we commissioned work on a study we ended up calling Early and Often. Some of this is so simple and obvious to all of us in this room. Where, when, why, and how should you engage patients early and often? But we really wanted to focus on kind of practical parts of the drug development process, specifically with industry, so less academic, but more where drug development is having an industry, and look at how biopharma companies can more effectively engage patients, how that engagement, which drives insights, disease understanding, methodologies, important outcome measures, et cetera, is actually quantified so that companies save time, money, and resources in advancing specific programs. So the first part of this paper that we're going to talk about a little bit more was really to make the case on why drug developers could benefit from engaging patients. So we flipped the conversation a little bit. For decades, we've been talking about why patients should have a seat at the table without really quantifying it in the language of the other people at the table. So the goal was to assume the obvious, everyone should be at the table, and then why does it matter? How can drug companies use patient engagement methodologies to ensure impact and be able to report metrics? So these are just some of the pieces of statistical information that has been published and it's sourced. But for example, if you do engage patients early and often in R&D, so this is before commercialization, but early, and I'll have the next slide will show how early, you can save over $500,000 in direct costs by avoiding even just one protocol amendment. Now, what does that mean? I sit in clinical development meetings all day, every day, where very cavalierly teams say, oh, we're going to file an amendment. If you can avoid filing an amendment, that avoids a regulatory process, saves thousands of dollars, but most importantly for patients, it moves things along faster. Every regulatory engagement, every amendment filing takes longer. So we really want to condense the time and get to meaningful scientific results as quickly as possible. And we do know, and there's now data that shows that every time you invest in patient engagement, you gain massive yields from a finance perspective. So holding pharmaceutical companies accountable for tracking and measuring this so that the next time you don't have to reinvent the wheel is really important for industry stakeholders. Our approach to the next phase of the work for Be Counted really leads to the next phase for Early and Often. There are frameworks that exist for patient engagement, and I've built many of these. I've led this work for a very long time. We're really at the low-hanging fruit stage, and we need to make this far more rigorous. For one of the reasons we focused on this clinical trial process is one of the first steps in establishing sites of care where you're going to run a clinical trial is a process called feasibility. And it often involves external third-party organizations who generally identify sites and investigators that have patients that can enroll in said study. It really does often lack the step of actually talking to the patient communities and patient advocacy groups about where the clinical trial ready patients really are. So the frameworks aren't robust enough and don't in tangible ways show where patient advocacy groups should be involved to eliminate extra steps in the future. So we did literature review, we did significantly extensive interviews with biopharmaceutical executives in all parts of the drug development process and industry. And then we are designing and developing a new model with tangible methodology, metrics reporting, reproducible results, and then we can figure out where the gaps are in the future. This is the just quick summary of slide of some areas of what's possible in the world of patient engagement across the research continuum. So from discovery, and I've had several conversations here about building mouse models and identifying cell lines and what should patient advocacy be responsible for. All of those pieces are really important in the early stages, all the way through preclinical, clinical development, FDA review, and post-approval. If any of you in the community gets to a place where you have a drug at FDA that's being considered for approval, demand to be in that meeting. Not just give a written testimony, but be in the meeting. It's a game changer. Charlene?
Thank you, Wendy. That was a really helpful background in terms of early and often, and I'd love to hear from both of you in terms of the question I'm about to pose. So Wendy, you said at the beginning of your presentation that we've been approaching this problem by talking about it as patients should be included more, I'm going to be reductive, but more as a mantra. And one of the goals here is to provide kind of a data-driven approach. How do you, a lot of this comes down to behavior change, of people within organizations. And so I'm curious about how you see, and I'll ask you this first, Wendy, and then I'd love to hear your feedback as well, Steve, around how do you see this framework being able to actually change behavior?
So I think that's a great question. It is behavior change, but coming at it from the other side of the coin, which is how do we speak their language, was sort of the approach we took. So if you look at what industry teams are thinking about prior to even target selection or prioritization for a clinical trial, there's kind of a roadmap that's considered. And if patient advocacy group consultation and expertise isn't engaged at that stage, we're going to keep doing things the way we always have, which clearly doesn't work. There are far more failed trials than successful trials. So let's just acknowledge we need to do something different. And then I really do think a lot of it is bringing the right patient advocates to the table for the right piece of work. So it's finding the right capability and ensuring you have people that can be at the table for the long term to guide the program through. And when the right people are in the room, the behaviors change.
Steve, you have a unique perspective because you had a long tenure within pharma, and now you're on the patient advocacy side. And I'm curious if you have any perspectives on this issue around kind of creating the right end state or behavior change.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, to put it in context, I was in the pharmaceutical industry for 16 years, and I've been CSO at TSC Alliance for 14 years. And when I think one of the things our CEO, Kari, is most proud of is when I said, after a couple of years, I said, when I was in pharma, and I was mostly at the discovery in that preclinical stage. And I said, we talked to KOLs, right? The physicians. We never talked to patient groups. And I said, if I ever went back to pharma, which I'm not planning on, but I would definitely, even at the discovery stage. And I think it's hard. It's developing kind of this evidence base of the difference it can make, because I can see it now being on the patient advocacy side that I just didn't see it before. It wasn't that we dismissed it. I think we didn't think about it back then. That's 14 years ago. A lot of behavior change. There are some companies who are doing very well. I see you back there, BridgeBio, at engaging very early at the preclinical stage. And some of the things that we've done is put some infrastructure in place to make it easy and attractive. So we have a natural history database that's almost 20 years old now, so it's got quite a bit of data in it. A number of organizations have registries or natural history studies. We've collected biosamples, so it makes it easy for companies who have questions about, their target, expression or so on, even at that discovery level, to have access to patient tissues or blood samples. And then 8 years ago, almost 9, we put in place a preclinical consortium where we took the licenses to certain animal models that had been developed in academia that were very robust and reproducible, and set up agreements with the CRO where we could house and breed and run experiments for those mice. And we could do it for academic researchers with money that we raised from donors. But we also, in our licenses, got that agreement to be able to run studies for industry. So they didn't have to go to Harvard and negotiate for a license, which may take a year, very long process. But we already had that. We'd already had that agreement, and so that really accelerated the ability of companies to engage at that very early stage with us and with the TSC Alliance. And that expertise that we have with the disease and with the models and the experience of running all these, I think it's really building a platform where if a company out there has an idea that might be relevant to TSC, like, why wouldn't they try it? We've kind of greased the skids, or as we heard yesterday, I'd never heard this before, we'd kind of opened the shell to that pistachio really wide so that it's easy and attractive for them to jump in there.
The pistachio, such a better vision than de-risking, right? And I love that example also because on the advocate side, we don't realize sometimes, some of these bumps in the road, if you will, but, the fact that an MTA or an agreement can take a year, and many, many iterations to get done between a biopharma and an academic organization. And the example that you just gave, where it's much easier actually to do an appropriate agreement with an advocacy group, and you've already set up the infrastructure. And one of the things that I had brought up in yesterday's discussion with Sonia was that 2 years into the STXBP1 Foundation's existence, we realized we had animal models that were giving inconsistent results, and so that specifically addresses any inconsistencies and creates like a very, very streamlined path. That's very cool. So and actually, because I'm going to ask Wendy about clinical trials in a second, but this is also a point around, this is not just early and often in terms of clinical trials, it's really an ability to pull that all the way through, as you said, into the discovery process. So, and Wendy, you've had experience on the clinical trial side of actually being able to advance trials, to even later phases through patient engagement.
Yeah, and I think kudos to the teams around me, because it really is a cultural mindset. But what my team leading patient advocacy was able to do is come to the table with an operating model. And that sounds a little impersonal, but we were able to say, all right, for this phase 1b/2a study, we have these 3 patient profiles who are going to be on these 3 clinical trial committees, and here's why. So it was actually a whole operating model within the construct of clinical trial development within our company. And we were working on a study for a post-transplant condition, and the patient that was on the executive steering committee was an equal member with all of the experts that were global experts that were on this committee. And we were in a meeting and they were asking questions. And I say this with all respect, but they skipped over the patient. And I stopped and I said, wait a minute, we've got to get her input. And they said, well, we'll come back to that to hear her story. And we were able to say, that's not why she's here. Now, this person would not mind my saying, she's stunningly beautiful, looks incredibly healthy. And when I pressed this investigator, his comment was, well, she didn't have this experience. And literally I said to her, stand up. And she was a little uncomfortable. This is a team of global experts. And, she was the patient representative. And she stood up and I said, just pull up your shirt. Her body is a crisscross of scars because she's had both a kidney and a lung transplant. So you can't see it, but she lived that experience and it stopped everybody in their tracks. But more importantly, it was a really safe environment to do that. And I can assure you that it turned the corner, and her input and involvement to that development program changed the endpoints we were going for, changed the rhetoric that we were going to take to FDA, and without question, advanced that stage of the study.
Wow. Can't judge a book by its cover, right? Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about, clinical trial sites and CROs. And, Steve, I know you have an example in terms of the clinical network that y'all have set up in TSC.
Yeah, so we have a number of I think about 75 TSC clinics or centers of excellence around the country that have different capabilities, in terms of clinical research, et cetera. But it's a lot of connections. And I think something that we've experienced, but I've also heard many other organizations, is that period in time when the sponsor company is looking for study sites, doing feasibility analysis, as you mentioned, and they generally outsource it to a CRO. And that just has faced a number of issues, I think, with patient advocacy groups. And it's not about the fact of using a CRO. We use CRO for our preclinical experiments. It's that disconnect between the sponsor and the patient advocacy group. I mean, so if a CRO comes to us, in that first conversation, I make clear before the second conversation, we need to know who the sponsor is, because we need to be connected. We need to have that. And another piece is if the CROs are employed, and you just said sometimes they don't reach out to the patient advocacy groups. And this is an experience with a recent clinical trial that the sponsor came to us kind of partway through recruitment. We're struggling to get recruitment. So, okay, share the list of sites. What do you have? And there were two things that we noticed, and on a general sense. One was there were some sites that they hadn't considered that we would have recommended, because knowing where our patients are and knowing the clinicians, et cetera. And then the other piece was sometimes they were at the site, but they weren't connected with the TSC expert there. So this was a clinical trial in epilepsy in TSC. And so the CRO, because it hadn't talked to us, went to the epilepsy experts that was probably in their database. The problem with TSC, and I bet there are many rare diseases where this is the case, it's a multi-system disorder. And it's generally seen by either TSC experts or more general neurocutaneous experts or rare disease, epilepsy experts. And it's not usually in the epilepsy clinic. And so if you go to the epilepsy PI, that's not the direct connection to the TSC patients. But if you haven't talked to the patient advocacy group, you don't know that. And so that's a gap that we've experienced, more than once. And so it's really that this is a message for industry. But from the patient advocacy point, I think anytime you're connected with industry, kind of make that point of what are the advantages, what do you have, that the connections to the clinics, and how you're willing to share and provide input at a very early stage.
And Steve, maybe this also connects back to the pitches that happened yesterday around what advocates should be always talking about, like the clinics that they have, who their KOLs are, where their patients are, if they have a census or they have some way that they're collecting data where they know what countries or what have you that their patients are. And you're saying do it early, not necessarily when you already know that there is a clinical trial being planned, but early and often
as much as you can. Yeah.
But I think that was one of the biggest takeaways for me yesterday, was empowering the patient advocacy groups to speak the right language. So say KOLs, name them, say these sites, like really get comfortable with what the language is, particularly in a pitch type session, because that adds credibility right away that, oh yeah, they understand what we mean. And I think we throw around the term natural history so much, but if it's actually patient identification, what countries, how many people, what sites they go to, those data as part of natural history are really valuable in helping companies prioritize and target a specific condition.
Yeah, and just speaking from the patient advocate side, one thing that I would say is that you just have to keep presenting it over and over again, and don't get frustrated when you realize that they missed it. Keep presenting it, because we actually had a sponsor who we had been going and presenting, our early stage. We had just at that time established, 4 clinics in the US, and had our map, had it color coded, where our patients were and all of that. And it was always in our, in our presentation decks. And we still had a CRO come to us, ask us the questions, and ask us the questions about where our clinics were. And it was frustrating, because once we knew who the sponsor was, we felt like, well, we've been very open about wanting to share this information and engage, and yes, but have to just keep on, connecting all the dots for them. So,
but I think I'm going to derail us here, because I think if you sit on the industry side, some of that early operational work is just that. There's a list of steps that are done, and this is how they've been done. And I wonder if we work better together, and, people in functions like mine can bring this internally to the table. But if the advocacy groups say early on, when you're engaging with a sponsor, who in clinical operations, who in clinical development, who needs to be aware of this work that's been done with KOLs and sites, just coming at it from a couple of different angles. Because I think so much of what happens early is just almost routine, and those are the habits we're trying to break.
I also see differences in company size. So, and they both have different issues, right? So in the larger companies, I worked for Pfizer for 8 years. There were large groups, and I've seen that in our interaction, the TSC Alliance with Novartis, who was an early, developed the first drug specifically for TSC, for the renal tumors in TSC. And just that people change over time, and there are different groups. There's the clinical group, and there's the marketing group. And my first year or two, I felt like a translator, because at least I could translate for the TSC Alliance. So that's industry talk. I know what they mean. This is what they mean. But there's that, and then on the smaller ones, because they're kind of building the organization as they grow, you might have been talking to the key people who are there, but then somebody else comes in, a clinical operations or a new CMO or something, and if you don't get that connection, you've suddenly lost the connection, right? So it's even though it's the same company, it's not one brain, it's still different people. And so needing to refresh those conversations as new people come on board is also important.
And at those larger organizations, what is your suggestion? I mean, obviously continuing to have the same message and take a step back and repeat the story, if you will. But are there ways that, like patient advocacy or, other people can help to thread that needle as you get introduced or progress through the stages of development? Like, what's your recommendation for advocates?
Yeah, well, most have a patient advocacy role now, which they didn't have, 15 years ago or more. So I think most have that, and so that person, and even if they change, they'll connect you to the next person. But having that person as your sort of primary contact, I think is really strong. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we usually want one who's the one person that we should talk to about everything, knowing that then specific topics will be different people, but that person can guide us. That's the way I would approach it, because I don't know of any company, except at the very early preclinical stage, that doesn't have a kind of a patient advocacy role. What do you think, Wendy?
Yeah, that's the model that I built. So I always say my function's the centralized point of contact, not sole point of contact, but making sure everything flows through us, because we can keep all the balls in the air and do the follow-up and hold people accountable for things that they've committed to the advocacy organizations. So that seems to be fairly effective. And then it's on us to identify who the other people are in the process that need, I always say, believe what we hear from the patient group. So it's not just a nice to have. We actually have to take that input as credible as all the other input that we're getting.
That's great. And Wendy, you had an example that that you had previously shared during our pre-call around, you know, sometime a situation where you had there were multiple trials happening at a single site. And again, coming back to this issue around recruitment and challenges with recruitment and how understanding the patients really made a difference in terms of addressing that issue, or could have made a difference.
Yeah, I think so. And it's happened on a couple of occasions, but just recently, you know, specifically in rare disease, often all of the trials are going to one or two critical sites, and those sites don't have the capacity to be able to serve all those trials. So it really is working with the patient advocacy organizations to understand where are there other potential new investigators or sites that have physicians in other departments who want to lead this work, and it is almost a passion project for them. So it gets back to early and often and really going to the advocacy groups with the right questions. I'm always careful to say it's not in place of a CRO feasibility or instead of. It should probably be in addition to. But it's really important to do that. And what we learned in this study, we'd been told that Australia recruited really fast. And when we dug in a little bit, we'd been told that by an external organization. When we dug in a little bit, it was literally a quote from a press release. It was not based in reality of what actually happened and how fast it happened. And the site that had quote unquote recruited so fast in Australia didn't have the capacity to do one more thing. So we ended up looking at a whole different country footprint of where to go, because patients with this condition aren't able to fly across the world for a study. So when we described the patient needs and the family needs, we then did the opposite approach and went back to the advocacy organizations and said, where can we be most successful to recruit the most people as fast as possible to get a scientific answer? And they pointed us to a completely different part of the world.
I have just a thought on, you know, helping to identify sites and kind of having, well, let me just describe it in terms of demonstrating sites, but I think it can get at addressing some of these things. Is I talked about our clinic network, but what we hadn't done with some of these trials that I mentioned before, and now kind of in response to that, we put in place more of a system, and this is inexpensive. It's really just coordinating and communication, right? To have a clinic, have the real network actually communicate, have us communicate across the network as a whole, with the idea that the next, you know, company running a trial comes along and can present to all of those clinics so they can hear about the opportunities, and those that have the capacity and the interest, and hopefully the patients can at least raise their hands, because they might be places that you know, they might not have been the top of our list. You might not be aware of them. The CRO maybe never, you know, worked with them before, but at least they can raise their hand and say, we'd be really interested. And then they could be vetted for feasibility. And maybe it's feasible and maybe it's not at those sites. But trying to cast that net a little bit wider, and it's also that opportunity for sites who are overwhelmed to say, this isn't, you know, we've got too much to do, or it's not of high enough interest to us with everything else we've got going on, and kind of back out and not have to worry about, you know, chasing them down.
It's a fantastic idea. And the other thing it does is not every trial in TCS is the exact same. It's different targets, different mechanisms of action. And we just had a situation where a site was not interested in a study we're doing because we're looking at X1. And the reality is we have a very different route of administration, which would probably make it attractive. But in the feasibility part, you know, of going back to the CRO and explaining, they didn't really tell the whole story. So I really like that idea of across the clinic network.
And do you envision that in terms of, is it a meeting, or it's actually like information that's kind of sent out and the labs are queried?
Well, I think we'd rather have it, have a virtual presentation. So
I
there is an
agree.
opportunity for Q&A and also recorded. So not everybody can necessarily be there who's going to want to see it, but then it's an opportunity for them to also hear the Q&A, after, and also get the presentation and be able to follow up later. Knowing that not everybody may view something like that, summary of slides and notes to at least get their attention can't hurt, touch multiple kind of touch points, but I think the best way is a conversation.
I just wanted to get the implementation direction. So I wanted to go back to one of the slides that, Wendy, that you presented, this $500,000 for a protocol amendment. And maybe can y'all explain what that means and
So
why?
she's from San Francisco and she's saying y'all like she's from Alabama. So just calling that out.
I grew up in Houston. It is one of the few things that I still retain from my youth, but and it's so useful.
All y'all's even more useful, but we digress.
But what does it mean? Like, why does it cost that much money? Like, what's in that number, or what, because, it is, on the face of it, it seems like you are changing something on a piece of paper and making filing that with your IRB, but what's really happening?
So that's a very fair question. And I'll say that number of almost 600,000 is actually very conservative, but it is a whole process change. So if you think about it at that level, it's changing a protocol that's been IRB approved at every site, been endorsed by the patient community, the physician community. So it's a whole process change to, instead of X, we're going to do Y, and then the rationale and the buy-in. So all of those pieces, and then you have to file all that paperwork again at each site. So it's a cumulative cost, but it's also a big drain on resources internally and a lot of regulatory follow-up. So the goal is to avoid amendments, and that happens in many different ways. But the first and kind of cardinal rule is engaging with the patient community early sets the trial up for success across so many parameters. So you have the right patient population, you have the right endpoints, you have the right measures, you have the right assessments. So as much as you can get it right, you avoid amendments. I don't know a trial that doesn't have any amendments, but there are many that it's just it's built into the cost of the study, and that's what we need to change.
Thank you. Well, you brought up the point, you brought up endpoints in terms of the protocol, and this what was a very important aspect that the STXBP1 community helped drive. So we initiated a disease concept model that was published in 2023, I think, and then that defined what our natural history study protocol was, which, we of course stand on the shoulders of giants in terms of, the neurodevelopmental groups that have gone before us, and really basically, taking their protocols and applying them against what was defined as important to patients from our disease concept model. And, I'm happy to say that our biopharma sponsors have really taken that work seriously, and the protocols that we've been starting to see in terms of clinical trials have really aligned with, all of that work. And so far, at least, that's a situation that, has really, I think, benefited and openly benefited from the patient advocacy work. We obviously had to do a ton of work to convince biopharma to work with us, through that process, including with the consortium that we've developed around the natural history study. But I don't know if there's examples that y'all have from your experiences around endpoint development and the importance of patient input into that.
I think so it's critically important, and we think about this like in epilepsy studies. Is it really just seizure counts, and seizure freedom, or is it measuring improvements in quality of life that occur even if the seizures aren't reduced by 100%? Maybe they're reduced by 40 or 50%, but it's enough to make an impact on quality of life. Or on cognition or communication behaviors, things like that. So we really advocate for those inclusions of those other endpoints. And then something that we're, hasn't been implemented, but we are certainly thinking about and would like to see is a concept that the endpoint may be individualized for different people. So TSC affects different people in different ways. Almost everybody has some neuropsychiatric issue, but they may be different. Some have full-blown autism, some don't. Some have some aspects of autism, maybe communication issues or social issues. Anxiety is very common in people with TSC, and especially for those who can't communicate well, behaviors, injurious behaviors to others or to themselves can also occur. And that's a huge impact on quality of life. But the concept of how do you measure those, if you, and this was done 10, almost 15 years ago now, there was a study done in TSC where researchers looked across a large battery of neuropsychological tests and whether an mTOR inhibitor, which is very good at, it's in the pathway of TSC and is very good at shrinking the tumors, and also approved for treatment of epilepsy. It's certainly not curative, but it helps some people. Whether that would change behavior in a measurable way, but the endpoints were these broad, measurements. And of course, very few, I shouldn't say nobody, very few are deficient in everything, right? So there are some parts of these scales that a person can't improve on because they're already, fully there. So you can't get a response on that part of the scale. So we didn't see any improvement in behaviors in that study, despite the fact there are a number of anecdotal descriptions of changes in behavior or responsiveness, receptive communication, things like that, being on mTOR inhibitors. So the concept that I think we need to work towards is one of looking at each person's most bothersome symptom, and this is a lesson that I learned from the migraine area, where there's 4 endpoints: pain, nausea, sensitivity to light, sensitivity to sound. And migraine drugs used to be, the gold standard was you did a trial and you looked at all 4 of those as an endpoint, but not everybody has all 4 of those. So they actually changed, the neurology division changed the guidance. So you had to have pain. And then before the trial, each participant pre-selected what was their most bothersome symptom of the other 3. So then you're not looking to improve something that is not bothering them. You're looking at the co-endpoint of 2. It's different from person to person, but there's only 3 different combinations, but that allows, I think, a more robust signal. And so those are things that we're thinking about in outcome measures for the neuropsychiatric issues. Is you could improve somebody in the place that they're having a problem. But if you measure lots of things, including places where they're not having a problem, you really smash your signal, your ability to get a signal out of it. So that's something that I would encourage folks to think about.
And that's great because it addresses the heterogeneity that is present in, so many rare diseases. Let's switch gears a little bit. We're going to open it up to questions, but I would be remiss if I did not talk about regulatory engagement. And so we've been talking a lot over the past few months. We had one of our rare advocacy exchange sessions on Ph.D.s, and clearly that's an important regulatory meeting where patient advocates are really at the fore. But are there other ways that advocates can and should be involved in the regulatory process?
Now, if you ask anybody at FDA that's honest with you, they say patients are welcome in every single meeting. So then the challenge is on the sponsor side to ensure that we take advantage of that opportunity. And I was talking to Amy Comstock a couple months ago, and she literally said to me, no one is taking advantage of this. So shame on us. So I'm holding myself accountable. But there are other methodologies as well. So the submissions that go to regulatory are often in sort of regulated documents like briefing books, or FDA will send out what's called an RFI, request for information. So whenever those types of communications happen, getting patient input to what goes back into the FDA as part of the RFI or what goes into the briefing book should include patient insights, patient testimonials, as well as videos. And so as advocacy groups, hold us accountable and to tell you when, where, and how and why we're doing this. But there's a lot more opportunity beyond PFDD, which is a great example of a really important learning and education session. And then what? Well, we just went back to a PFDD that my company was part of a few years ago to pull information from that to support a briefing book. So make sure all that information is being used.
Why don't we go ahead and open it up to questions? There's a couple of mics here. We have. Any questions? People have been quiet today.
Thank you. In the session this morning, Wendy Chung talked about kind of starting with the end in mind. And in terms of this discussion, I'm wondering why we don't look at the end point. What does the FDA need to approve something before we even start planning a trial or finding patients?
I'm going to jump in because we try to do that on the sponsor side, but I think we have to be really clear. If we leaned on that too much, there would be very little innovation. And I'll give a sort of simple example. For neuromuscular rare disease studies, every study would have to have a 6-minute walk test, meaningful outcome. When walking is rarely the most important thing to patients suffering with those conditions. But because that was sort of the regulatory measure early on, we'd have to get to that endpoint today. So I think there's a step in the middle of really ensuring that FDA understands the condition for which the study is happening, understands what matters to patients and families. Quality of life is a great example, but how do you quantify that and make that data driven and then back up into the clinical study design?
I think having the patient community involved in these meetings, like you said, I understand, having been in industry, the risk averseness of what could happen. Something bad could happen in that meeting.
Could slow things down.
Oh, yeah. But I still don't understand why they don't invite us, because there are sophisticated people in advocacy groups, and there are very sophisticated parents who know more about this disease than many of the physicians who treat them, who could speak very clearly and defend the endpoints that hopefully they've discussed with the sponsor. The patient advocates have discussed with the sponsor for years, and be able to defend why is this important and why is the 6-minute walk test, for example, not important. Yeah. We had a trial that was mandated to the sponsor by the EMA, that was to get approval for this particular drug, because it was from 2 years and up, to get it down to from birth onward. And because seizures can start within first few months of birth, that was important. They were requiring a thorough PK study in infants less than 1 year old, of hooking them up and taking 6 samples of blood throughout the day. We're like, how big do you think these kids are? And nobody's going to go for this. And we kept telling the sponsor, but the sponsor would then go to the regulator and say, okay, we'll take fewer, but we still got to have that PK. And we were never able to speak to the regulators directly. It was this back and forth. And guess what? The trial never enrolled. It was finally just dropped because nobody would participate in that. And that's what we told them, from the beginning. But we couldn't tell the regulators directly. It was always indirect.
We're in the room, right? The room where it happens. Any other questions? All right. So I'm going to ask you both for your last word, last phrase, last sentence, closing thought for early and often and clinical, engaging advocates in clinical trials. And I will start with you, Wendy.
Thank you, all y'all. I really think that my call to action is for the advocates and parents in the room, hold the sponsor companies accountable, ask the questions, make the demands, don't worry about hurting feelings. Your voices are critically important. And on the other side, for my peers in industry, open the door, listen, bring patient advocacy groups in early, understand their capability and their interests, and don't reinvent the wheel.
I think that's very well said. One thing that I've talked to a couple of people about over the last couple of days is, when getting advice, so if you're developing a strategy of any kind, whether it's an endpoint strategy or just a research strategy, right? For, because many of the groups represented here are very early. And so what do we do? Where do we start? One place to start is with those who are the experts in the clinical aspects of the disease or in the biology of the disease. But I would include some industry people in those kinds of strategic discussions. They don't have to be working on your disease, but to be able to talk from that industry perspective about what's needed, because the academic answer is not always the one that is going to get you to to a potential treatment first. It may not be. It might be, but it might not be. And I think it's very helpful to have that industry perspective to ask what are the critical questions for them, because what we want is anybody with an idea to be working on our disease, right? And what do we need to put in place to make that happen?
Building that ecosystem and realizing that people can bring different perspectives. Yeah, agree. Well, thank you both for a wonderful session. And I am going to go ahead and close out our Rare Drug Development Symposium. So I hope that you leave here with new insights on rare disease drug development, and patient advocacy driven strategies. I also hope you're leaving here with a number of new network contacts. It was really awesome to see all of the groupings and seeing people engage and meet new people. It's so critical in terms of building the ecosystem. As I said in my opening remarks, I want you to stay in touch, update me over this next year on, what your successes, what your challenges are. It's really important that we advance this community together. I want to thank our amazing Global Genes, my amazing Global Genes team, for all of the work to put this event on. Thank you so much. This has been a tremendous 2 days. You'll also be receiving an email, and I think that that's actually also the QR code for a post-event survey. We welcome your feedback, good and critical, so we can continue to make this event very valuable for you. And safe travels, everyone. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your last announcement from the Voice in the Sky. For those attendees who will be attending the rare rounds at Alexion, please gather in the main lobby. We will be Ubering over in groups. Thank you so much.